Calla Whitmore never thought the sound of a fountain pen scratching across ivory paper would become the moment her freedom disappeared. But as her signature dried beneath Everett Maddox's, her fate was sealed with invisible chains. Raised with grace and quiet dreams, she was the kind of woman who cherished whispers over noise, who believed love bloomed slowly like spring roses. Not like this, not as a transaction. Yet desperation had a cruel voice, and when her father's empire crumbled like a sandcastle under a rising tide, her choices narrowed to one: sacrifice herself to save what little dignity her family had left. Everett Maddox stood across from her in a perfectly tailored black suit, looking every inch the legend whispered about in Forbes articles and Wall Street circles. Impossibly handsome, devastatingly cold, his blue eyes colder than December frost, unreadable and indifferent. He didn't flinch as the vows were spoken by a judge, not a priest, in a glass-ceilinged estate overlooking the sea, where witnesses were legal advisors and silence was more present than joy. She wore white because tradition demanded it, but the gown felt more like a costume for a role she hadn't auditioned for: virgin bride, sold savior, collateral in a high-stakes game. When the final words were said, there were no cheers, no kisses, just a brittle silence, and the weight of a golden band sliding onto her finger like a shackle. Everett didn't smile, didn't look at her, only turned on polished shoes and gestured for the driver. Hours later, in his coastal mansion, the air hung thick with unsaid words and sterile elegance. The wind slammed against the glass like a warning. Calla walked the marbled halls alone, her heels echoing like a countdown to a life she didn't choose. In the master bedroom, candlelight flickered like frightened secrets. He finally spoke, voice like steel behind velvet. "You'll have my name, my house, and my protection, but not my heart, and not my touch." The words carved through her like ice. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that in her old room the night before, clutching the last family photo before packing her soul into a suitcase. Calla met his gaze, steady yet quietly shattered, and nodded with the grace of a woman determined not to beg for affection she would never receive. She walked past him and stood by the window, watching the ocean rage beneath the cliffs, realizing she'd just married a man who treated love like a liability. Behind her, Everett retreated into the shadows, leaving her to the storm both outside and within. That night, she lay in a king-size bed that felt too vast, too cold, too lonely, while her husband worked in another wing, as distant as the moon. As thunder echoed, she wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but to hold together the pieces of a heart already splintering. She whispered silent promises into the dark, that she would survive this, even if it meant never being touched, never being loved. For her, love had always been a storybook hope. For Everett, it was a ghost he refused to resurrect. Two strangers under one roof, bound not by affection, but by ink and obligation, unknowingly standing at the edge of a story that would burn, bleed, and bloom. Calla rose from the bed that still smelled of ocean wind and unfamiliarity, her body wrapped in layers of satin and silence, stepping into a house that wasn't a home, but a frozen kingdom built by a man who had forgotten how to feel. The halls were wide enough to swallow echoes, and the chandeliers above her glowed with soulless grandeur, casting light on surfaces too perfect, too untouched, just like the man she had married. The staff moved like polished ghosts, courteous but distant, their eyes flickering away from hers like they knew she was a placeholder, not a person. Everett remained a shadow in motion, slipping from the mansion before dawn and returning long after the stars had grown weary of watching. His presence lingered in scent and sound, a jacket draped over a chair, a phone call echoing through his study, but never in voice, never in warmth. Every morning, Calla laid out his coffee just the way he took it, memorizing the strength and sweetness he preferred. Yet it was always taken without a word, like a service, not a gesture. She tried to write small notes, quotes about healing, hope, change, hoping one would make him pause, even breathe differently. But he never said a word, never left a reply, never even looked her in the eye. She'd catch fleeting glimpses of him across the hall or in the reflection of passing mirrors. And in those half-second glances, she saw something ancient buried behind his blue eyes. Pain that had turned into architecture, guilt that had been carved into his bones. He wasn't cruel, but his absence was its own kind of violence. One night she left dinner on the table and waited in the dim light of the dining room for hours, only to find the plate untouched the next morning, her carefully folded napkin left like an unopened letter. The walls of the mansion weren't just cold, they were watchful. Every corner felt like it was guarding a secret. One corridor, long and lined with portraits that seemed to disapprove of her presence, led to a locked door with a brass handle dulled by time and dust. She asked about it casually once, and the housekeeper flinched before muttering that the room hadn't been opened in years. No one dared to enter. The silence that followed her question was louder than any warning. Days passed, and nights bled together, and though Calla smiled with practiced grace and carried herself with quiet dignity, loneliness was beginning to suffocate her. It wasn't the solitude, it was the rejection, the constant reminder that she was married in name, but invisible in soul. She heard Everett once in the West Wing, arguing with someone on the phone, his voice strained and sharp, a glimpse of fire beneath the ice. But it faded before she could make sense of the words. Then it happened, on a rain-soaked night, when thunder prowled along the coast and lightning cracked across the black sky like punishment. She was drawn from sleep by a sound, muffled, raw, human. Slipping into the hallway barefoot, she followed it, guided by instinct more than reason. It led her to that forbidden door, and behind it, the broken sobs of a man unraveling. She pressed her palm against the wood, her breath trembling. Then she heard it, one name, spoken like a prayer through shattered glass. Lena. Her blood chilled. That name wasn't hers. It belonged to someone who still lived in the marrow of this mansion, someone whose memory Everett clung to like a lifeline. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, her back against the cold wall, letting the truth settle over her like frost. This wasn't just about a contract marriage. It was about a man still married to grief, a heart still tethered to a grave. And she was the stranger asked to live in that graveyard without making a sound. That night, Calla didn't try to leave. She didn't break down. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared out at the storm, the lightning casting sharp shadows across the room, and she whispered to herself, "I see you, even if you never see me." She was beginning to realize that her war wasn't with Everett. It was with the silence, the sorrow, the unseen love that still lingered like perfume in the air. And though her heart had already started to crack, she promised herself one thing. She wouldn't run from the cold. She would stand in it, endure it, and maybe, just maybe, thaw it. The storm outside had faded, but the one inside Calla only began to brew darker clouds, the kind that didn't make noise but devoured everything quietly. The name Lena echoed like a secret tattooed on the mansion walls, invisible yet everywhere, written in the frost that clung to the windows, whispered through the hush of the servants, and etched in the cold way Everett blinked when Calla said something too kind. Days passed, yet the memory of that broken sob on the other side of the locked door haunted her more than her own reflection. She began to dig, not out of jealousy but necessity, a search not for gossip but for understanding. In the corner of the library, buried under law books and untouched ledgers, she found a yellowed newspaper with a headline too cruel to forget. Tragedy strikes billionaire. Heir, fiancé dies in fiery crash. There was a photo of Lena, beautiful, alive, smiling, and Everett, young and unaware of the avalanche heading his way. Below the article, in tiny print, details spilled like poison: drunken argument, speeding car, unsalvageable wreckage. Rumors said Everett had been driving. Others claimed he was found kneeling beside the car, screaming her name until his throat bled. The truth was lost in whispers, but guilt had rooted itself deep in his soul either way. Calla sat on the library floor for hours, the pages trembling in her hands, her heart torn not from betrayal but sorrow. How could a man who once loved so deeply now be a ghost in his own life? That night, she found him standing in the garden, staring at the moon like it was a judge. She stepped toward him slowly, breath held between fear and compassion, and asked the question that had been burning her alive. Was it you behind the wheel that night? He didn't flinch, didn't blink, but his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might break. I told you never to ask about her, he growled, his voice raw, a wildfire trying to contain itself. I told you to stay out of things you don't understand. But she didn't move. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him, her eyes soft but unyielding, and said, I'm not trying to fix you, Everett. I just want to know who I married. And that was when he snapped, not violently, but tragically. He turned on her, eyes flashing, not with anger, but pain so deep it was nearly unspeakable. You think you're different? You're not. You're just a name on a piece of paper, a placeholder in a life that stopped the day she died. His voice shattered like glass thrown at the truth, and the wound behind his words bled so visibly it silenced her more effectively than a scream. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she walked past him, one foot in front of the other, calm as a woman walking through fire she could no longer feel. That night, she returned to her bedroom, pulled out the leather-bound journal hidden beneath her pillow, and began to write with a hand that shook, not from weakness, but from the quiet strength of survival. I married a ghost, she wrote, her pen slicing through the paper with every syllable. But I'm still alive. I still breathe. I still feel. And somehow, I still hope. Tears didn't come easily, but her soul cried as the ink dried on the page, a silent scream across parchment. The walls around her whispered stories of a love that died in fire. But Calla knew. Grief could not be exorcised by silence, and ghosts only haunted those who refused to face them. Everett had built an empire from ashes, but in doing so, he'd buried the last piece of his humanity. And now she lay awake in a bed that once promised forever, but now held nothing but echoes. She didn't know if she wanted his love anymore. Only the truth, only a glimpse of the man beneath the suit and shadows. Somewhere deep down, a question flickered like a stubborn flame. Could she ever be more than a replacement? Could he ever let go of the girl he lost to see the woman standing right in front of him? That night, the wind whispered through the cracks of the mansion, like fate was listening, but neither of them spoke again. Not that night, not yet. Only silence answered, and sometimes silence is the most painful reply of all. The silence in the mansion thickened after that night like fog that refused to lift, wrapping itself around Calla's chest until even breathing felt like betrayal. Days passed in quiet rituals, unspoken breakfasts, unopened books, unshared glances, and just when she began to think this numbness would become her new reality, a letter arrived. It was slipped beneath her bedroom door, no stamp, no name, just a folded piece of cream paper that smelled faintly of rain and dust. Her heart raced as she opened it with shaking fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and urgent. You deserve to know the truth about Lena. Meet me tonight. 9 p.m., Rosewood Cemetery. She should have ignored it, thrown it into the fire, and stayed inside her carefully assigned silence. But something inside her, something stubborn, aching, still burning, compelled her to go. That night, dressed in a plain coat and courage she didn't know she had, Calla stepped into the shadows and left the house without a word. The cemetery was wrapped in darkness, fog curling around the tombstones like secrets. And she found him there, a tall man with eyes like Everett's but filled with rage instead of guilt. He introduced himself as Declan Pierce, Lena's older brother, and his voice was a slow-burning flame, controlled but deadly. He told her he never believed Everett was at fault, despite what the world whispered. Lena had found something, Declan said, his eyes never leaving hers. Something dangerous, something buried in the financials of a company Everett's father was about to partner with. She was going to expose it, and days later, she was dead. Calla felt the ground shift beneath her feet, reality fracturing like glass under pressure. She asked the question she hadn't dared to speak. You think someone silenced her? Declan nodded grimly, saying the car crash was too convenient, too clean. Everett blamed himself because he argued with her that night, but he wasn't even driving. She left alone, and he's been wearing that guilt like a shroud ever since. Calla's breath caught. What if all this time, Everett had been punishing himself for a crime he didn't commit? What if the walls he built weren't made of cruelty, but of mourning twisted by misunderstanding? She returned to the mansion with a heart pounding like war drums, unsure whether to tell him or hide what she knew. But Everett was already waiting, anger radiating from him like a fire too long starved. "Where were you?" he demanded, voice low but sharp enough to slice. She tried to speak gently, but he stepped closer, his blue eyes blazing, shoulders tense with betrayal. "Why do you care what killed her? You're not her," he hissed, and the words were daggers wrapped in thunder. Calla didn't flinch, didn't cry. Her pain had grown roots by now. She looked at him with eyes not of accusation, but of impossible sorrow, and said, barely above a whisper, "Because someone has to care about you, even if it breaks me." The words hung between them, fragile and trembling, before Everett turned away, fists clenched, breath ragged. That night, the sky opened up in a storm that mirrored everything they refused to say. Rain crashed against the glass like fate demanding entry, and Everett, usually composed and distant, sat alone in the darkened sitting room with a bottle of aged whiskey and a soul unraveling in silence. Lightning illuminated the edges of the truth now clawing at his chest. He stared into the fire but saw nothing but Lena's face, Calla's eyes, and the unbearable burden he had chained to his heart for too long. Upstairs, Calla lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the storm, and wondering how love could be born in a house that only knew ghosts. She knew now that Everett wasn't the villain of this story, but a man haunted by lies, loss, and silence. She wondered if he would ever let her in, or if his war with the past would always keep him just out of reach. As thunder rolled through the sky and lightning painted brief moments of clarity, Calla whispered to herself, not in hope, but in defiance. Even a house of ice can melt. Downstairs, Everett lifted the bottle to his lips, trying to drown guilt that had no source, truth that had no closure, and a love he had never dared to believe could be real again. The storm roared louder than ever, as if the heavens themselves were trying to shatter the walls of the mansion and the emotional dam within it. Lightning slicing through the sky with relentless fury while rain pounded the windows like a truth long denied demanding entry. Everett stood at the edge of the veranda, soaked through to the skin, whiskey forgotten, pain drenching him as much as the rain itself, until the wind howled so hard it rattled the glass and forced him back inside. The entire estate was cloaked in darkness, power gone, backup systems silent, and the once bright chandeliers hung like ghosts, useless and forgotten. He moved through the dim halls slowly, dripping, breath heavy, no longer the composed billionaire, but a man unraveling at the seams. In the living room, a faint glow flickered from the fireplace, the only living warmth in the mansion. And there, curled up on the floor with a blanket around her shoulders, sat Calla, still, calm, her eyes reflecting flames and something softer than forgiveness. He paused at the threshold, unsure if he was even worthy of being seen in this broken state, but she looked up and met his gaze, not with pity, not with fear, but with something he hadn't seen in years, understanding. Without speaking, she slid over, making space beside her, and Everett moved like a man approaching a confessional, each step weighed down by years of self-inflicted exile. As he sat beside her, shivering and silent, their eyes met again, and for the first time, there was no guard between them, no bitterness, no contract, only two souls sharing warmth in a house that had known too much cold. The crackle of the fire filled the silence until his voice, rough and low, broke through. "I've hated myself for years." The words came out like a wound bleeding in the open. "And I hated you," he added, his breath trembling, "because you reminded me of everything I never deserved." His face twisted with the shame of it, but Calla didn't recoil. She turned toward him, her voice soft but rooted in something unshakable. "You don't have to deserve love," she whispered. "You just have to stop running from it." His eyes searched hers as if he'd never truly seen her until now. And when his hand rose to her face, it wasn't with hunger or dominance, but with reverence, a touch that trembled like the first time light touches a cave after years of dark. His fingers grazed her cheek, brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen, and in that fragile moment, all the weight of grief and guilt dissolved between them. He leaned in slowly, his lips brushing hers in the gentlest kiss, not a spark of desire, but a surrender to something purer, something healing. It wasn't fast or fevered. It was soft, sacred, like two broken hearts pressing together to see if they still beat. And when they pulled apart, neither of them spoke, because some moments are too holy for words. They didn't cross lines or chase heat. They wrapped themselves in the blanket, leaning into each other as the fire snapped and hissed beside them, warmth returning not to their bodies, but to their souls. That night, love wasn't found in skin or desire, but in forgiveness offered, pain shared, and silence no longer feared. Outside, the storm finally began to fade, and inside, two strangers who had once been bound by paper were now connected by something far more powerful: understanding, vulnerability, and the first fragile roots of real, unconditional love. The morning after the storm, the mansion felt different, warmer, softer, almost breathable, like the silence had finally released its grip on the walls, and the ghosts had momentarily retreated into the shadows. Calla woke to the golden haze of sunlight slipping through the windows, her heart heavy but full, her fingers still tingling from the memory of Everett's trembling touch, his kiss that had asked for forgiveness rather than desire. They had said so little, but in that silence something had shifted. Something real had begun to root itself. She stepped into the day lighter than before, unaware that everything was about to shatter beneath her feet. It started with a phone call Everett took behind closed doors, one that lasted too long and ended in silence too loud. Then came the visitor, Declan again, this time with documents in hand, not rumors. As Calla passed by the study, she heard her name, her father's name, Lena's name, all tangled together in a storm of accusations and truths, too cruel to be coincidence. She paused, heart thudding, breath locked in her lungs, until the door creaked open and Everett emerged, eyes cold again, colder than the night they first married. And this time, it wasn't grief in them. It was betrayal. "Did you know?" he asked, voice sharp as a blade freshly drawn. Calla blinked, confused, the fear crawling up her spine faster than her mouth could form words. "Know what?" she whispered. Everett threw the documents onto the table between them. Bank transfers, signed affidavits, emails, evidence. Her father had brokered a deal with one of Everett's fiercest competitors. In exchange for key shares, her father fed them information about Everett's operations. And worse, much worse, he had been involved in the cover-up of Lena's death. The rival company had orchestrated the crash to silence Lena before she could go public, and her father, drowning in debt and desperate for power, had allowed it. Calla staggered back as if struck. "I didn't know," she choked, but Everett wasn't listening. The man who had touched her with such tenderness only hours ago now stared at her, like she was a weapon forged to destroy him. "Was this your plan all along?" he spat, his voice trembling not with rage but devastation. "To finish what your father started?" The words cracked something deep inside her, deeper than she thought was even still breakable. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She stood still, tears falling like quiet apologies, her eyes not wide with defense but hollow with heartbreak. "You think I'd sell you out?" she asked, the pain in her voice soft but piercing. "You think I could sit beside you, hold your hand, listen to your grief, touch your wounds, and still conspire behind your back?" But Everett didn't answer. He looked away, as if even seeing her was too much. That night, Calla packed her things, not in anger, not in defiance, but in unbearable sorrow. She took only what she came with, leaving behind the gowns, the jewelry, the opulence that had never belonged to her anyway. On the marble dresser, she placed her wedding ring with a note written in the same journal she once used to write her silent heartbreak. "I never lied to you. I just loved you too honestly." The ink smeared with tears, but she didn't rewrite it. She walked out of the estate alone, no driver, no car, just a small suitcase, and 1,000 shattered dreams trailing behind her. Days turned into weeks, and she found herself back in the town where no one knew her as a billionaire's wife. Just as Miss Calla, the art teacher with soft eyes and a broken smile. She rented a modest apartment, took a job teaching painting to children at the local community center, and tried to piece together the fragments of a life that had never really been hers. Every morning she dipped her brush into color, trying to paint something that didn't bleed, but even the reds seemed to cry and the blues whispered his name. She didn't check the news. She didn't call him. She let him believe whatever he needed to believe to survive. Because love wasn't just about holding on, it was also about letting go when your presence became poison. She watched the children laugh, their fingers smeared with color, their joy untouched by betrayal, and she wondered if she'd ever laugh like that again. She walked through the farmer's market on Sundays, smiled at strangers, held her own hand at night, and told herself that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about forgiving yourself for what you couldn't change. Sometimes she caught her reflection in windows and saw a woman who looked like her, but didn't feel like her. And sometimes, just before sleep, she'd close her eyes and feel his hand on her cheek again. The one moment of truth before everything collapsed. She didn't hate him. She just missed who they might have been if life had been kinder, if the past hadn't clawed them into enemies. She never expected him to come find her, but sometimes she left her door unlocked, just in case he ever realized the truth wasn't in the evidence, but in the way she looked at him that night by the fire, when love had melted years of frost with nothing but silence and a single touch. Spring had crept in quietly, painting the small town with soft greens and hopeful blooms, the kind of beauty that arrived without fanfare, but lingered like a promise. Calla moved through her days with grace stitched from survival, her smile more honest now, her heart still bruised but learning how to beat without trembling. She stood at the easel in the art center, guiding a child's brushstroke as laughter bubbled through the classroom, when the world shifted again, not loudly, not with thunder, but with the quiet click of the door opening behind her. She turned expecting a parent or volunteer, but her breath caught when she saw him. Everett, no suit, no entourage, just a man in a simple shirt, standing soaked in the spring rain, looking like he had walked 1,000 miles just to find her. Her fingers dropped the brush, and for a moment, time obeyed their silence. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her like she was something sacred he'd spent his whole life unworthy of. Then, with a voice hoarse from distance and confession, he whispered, "I found the truth, Calla. About everything. About your father, about Lena, about what really happened that night." His eyes shimmered with the weight of everything he hadn't said. Guilt, shame, hope. And then he stepped closer, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. "You were never the lie. You were the only truth I ever had," he said. And something inside her cracked, not from pain, but from release. He told her how he had confronted the rival company, unearthed the documents proving her father had been manipulated too, used as a pawn in a much larger scheme, how he had shut down every corrupt division tied to that legacy, how he'd sold the mansion not because he was running, but because he didn't want to live in a house built on ghosts. He had started a foundation in Lena's name to support women in journalism and investigative work, giving her voice back in a world that tried to silence it. "But I didn't come here for closure," he said, reaching into his coat pocket with trembling fingers. "I came here for you." And then, in front of a room filled with children and paint and the raw, messy beauty of real life, Everett Maddox sank to one knee, not with grandeur, not with performance, but with reverence. He opened a small box, inside it a ring that sparkled not from wealth, but from meaning. No contracts, no timelines, no conditions. Just forever, if you'll have me. Calla stared at him, heart thunderous, vision blurred by tears she hadn't expected to fall so freely. The children watched with wide eyes, holding their paintbrushes mid-air, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. She dropped to her knees too, cupped his face in her hands and whispered through her tears, "I never needed a mansion, Everett. I just needed you to be real." He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek, and she kissed it away. "You were my storm, Calla," he murmured, voice shaking. "But you also became my calm." Her lips curved into the first true smile in months, one born not from relief but joy. "Yes," she whispered, not because he was powerful or rich, but because he was finally hers. Not in paper, not in pretense, but in truth. They embraced, not like lovers returning, but like survivors finding home in each other's arms. The sky outside opened just as they kissed, spring rain falling in soft sheets, soaking them in something that felt like rebirth. The children squealed and clapped, some running to the windows, others giggling behind paint-streaked hands, while Calla and Everett stood in the center of it all, soaked, smiling, whole. The rain kissed their faces, and in that moment, everything made sense. Not the pain, not the betrayal, but the journey that led them here. Two broken souls who had dared to stay, dared to listen, dared to love. Their past didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled them. Forgiveness didn't rewrite history, but it gave them a future. And as they stood under that gentle storm, lips pressed together, hearts finally in sync, it felt like destiny had chosen to rewrite their ending. Not in ink, but in rain and truth, and in love that refused to die.